The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the Fort Worth stockyards, its rays cutting through the dust clouds that perpetually hung over the arena like a shroud. The thermometer outside the Will Rogers Memorial Center read 97 degrees, but inside the arena, surrounded by thousands of screaming fans, it felt like the gates of hell had opened wide. Jason McCall adjusted his worn leather gloves one final time, the familiar ritual as ingrained in his muscle memory as breathing itself. At 34, Jason was no longer the young hotshot who had burst onto the professional bull riders circuit 15 years ago with dreams as big as the Texas sky. The lines around his eyes had deepened from years of squinting against arena lights and desert sun. His shoulders bore the permanent slight forward hunch of a man who had been thrown, trampled, and beaten by 2,000 pounds of pure rage more times than he cared to count. But his hands remained steady, and his heart still hammered with the same fierce determination that had carried him through countless 8-second battles. "McCall, you're up next," called Randy Torres, the event coordinator, his voice barely audible over the thunderous crowd. The stands were packed to capacity, 23,000 people who had come to witness the finest bull riders in the world test themselves against the most dangerous animals on earth. Among them sat Jason's wife Sarah, her auburn hair catching the arena lights as she gripped the railing with white knuckles. She hadn't missed one of his rides in 8 years of marriage, though Jason knew each one aged her a little more. The bull waiting in chute number 7 was legendary in the worst possible way. Reaper stood 16 hands high and weighed 1,770 pounds of muscle, bone, and barely contained fury. His black hide was scarred from countless battles, and his eyes held an intelligence that made even seasoned cowboys uneasy. In 43 career trips, Reaper had been successfully ridden to the 8-second whistle exactly 0 times. He had sent 19 riders to the hospital, 3 of them with career-ending injuries. Jason's best friend and traveling partner, Miguel Santos, helped him into his protective vest. Miguel's normally jovial expression was grim as he checked each strap and buckle with methodical precision. "You don't have to do this, hermano," Miguel said quietly, using the Spanish endearment he had called Jason since their rookie year together. "You've already qualified for the finals. Your points are secure." Jason shook his head without hesitation. "I've been chasing this bull for 3 years, Miguel. 3 years of watching him make fools of better riders than me. If I walk away now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what if." The arena announcer's voice boomed over the sound system, his practiced showmanship adding electricity to an already charged atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen, entering chute 7, we have 3-time world champion Jason McCall from Weatherford, Texas, about to face the most feared bull in professional rodeo today. Reaper has never been successfully ridden, and he's put more cowboys in the hospital than any bull in the past decade." Jason climbed the rails of the chute, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that had sustained his career through countless injuries and setbacks. Reaper shifted beneath him, a mountain of barely controlled power. The bull's breathing was deep and deliberate, like a boxer preparing for the fight of his life. Jason wrapped the bull rope around his gloved hand with practiced efficiency, each loop precisely placed for maximum grip and control. The crowd fell silent as Jason lowered himself onto Reaper's broad back. The bull's hide was warm and slick with sweat, the muscles beneath twitching with anticipation. Jason adjusted his position, finding the sweet spot just behind the bull's massive shoulders where he might have the best chance of staying aboard for the required 8 seconds. His heart rate slowed as he entered the zone that had served him well throughout his career, a place where time moved differently and instinct took over from conscious thought. "Whenever you're ready, champ," called the gate operator, his hand resting on the release mechanism. Jason nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Turn him loose." The gate swung open and Reaper exploded from the chute like a rocket launched from hell itself. His first jump carried both bull and rider 8 feet into the air, Jason's body snapping like a whip as 1,700 pounds of fury landed hard on the arena floor. The impact sent shockwaves through Jason's spine, but he held on, his left hand locked in the bull rope while his right arm flew free for balance. Reaper spun to the left, his massive head lowering as he kicked his hind legs skyward with devastating force. Jason felt his grip beginning to slip but managed to adjust his position, drawing on years of experience to anticipate the bull's next move. The crowd roared its approval as the two adversaries engaged in their ancient dance of domination and defiance. For seconds in, Reaper changed tactics with the cunning that had made him legendary. Instead of the wide, sweeping spins that most bulls favored, he began a series of sharp, jarring stops and starts, each movement designed to throw off his rider's timing and balance. Jason felt his body beginning to slide forward, gravity and momentum conspiring against him as Reaper's strategy began to take effect. 6 seconds. Jason was still aboard, his left hand numb from the crushing grip required to stay connected to the bull rope. Reaper sensed his advantage and increased the intensity of his assault, spinning clockwise while dropping his massive head and kicking with both hind legs simultaneously. The movement was so violent that Jason's teeth clicked together hard enough to draw blood from his tongue. 7 seconds. The crowd was on its feet, sensing that they might be witnessing history in the making. Jason could feel victory within his grasp, could almost taste the triumph that had eluded him for 3 long years. 1 more second. Just 1 more second, and he would become the first rider ever to successfully complete an 8-second ride on the legendary Reaper. But bulls, like life itself, rarely follow the scripts written by human ambition. With lightning speed, Reaper pivoted in a move known as a belly roll, a maneuver where the bull turns so sharply that he essentially flips his rider over his head. Jason felt his grip fail as physics took over, his body launching through the air in a trajectory that carried him directly into Reaper's path. Time slowed to a crawl as he realized with crystal clarity that he was about to land in the worst possible position, directly beneath the bull's thundering hooves. Jason hit the arena floor hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a violent rush. Before he could roll away or even attempt to protect himself, Reaper's 1,700 pounds crashed down on top of him with the force of a small earthquake. Jason felt his lower back explode in a white-hot supernova of pain as his L2 and L3 vertebrae compressed under the immense weight. The sound of bone breaking was audible even over the horrified gasps of the crowd. Reaper, still in full battle mode, spun away from the fallen rider with his head lowered, searching for his next target. The bullfighters rushed in with practiced precision, their colorful shirts and aggressive movements designed to draw the bull's attention away from the motionless figure lying in the dirt. It took 3 men to convince Reaper to leave the arena, the bull still snorting and pawing the ground as if offended that his opponent had dared to challenge him in the first place. Jason lay perfectly still in the dirt, his body positioned at an unnatural angle that sent ice-cold terror through everyone who saw it. He tried to move his legs but felt nothing, as if someone had simply erased the lower half of his body from existence. The taste of blood filled his mouth, and he could feel warm wetness spreading beneath his back, though whether it was blood or other bodily fluids he couldn't tell. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the Rodeo's medical director, reached Jason's side within 30 seconds of the impact. Her experienced hands moved quickly but carefully, checking for signs of spinal injury while monitoring his vital signs. Jason tried to speak, but could only manage a weak whisper. "Can't feel my legs, Doc," he managed, his voice barely audible above the concerned murmur of the crowd. "Can't feel anything below my waist." Dr. Hernandez's face remained professionally calm, but Jason caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. She had seen enough spinal injuries to recognize the signs immediately. "Don't try to move, Jason," she said firmly. "We're going to take excellent care of you. The paramedics are on their way." Sarah was fighting her way through the crowd, her face pale with terror as security personnel tried to keep spectators away from the medical team. Miguel had vaulted the arena barrier and was running toward his fallen friend, his own safety forgotten in his desperation to help. The arena fell silent except for the sound of approaching sirens and the occasional nervous snort from horses in the holding pens. The paramedics arrived with a backboard and cervical collar, their movements swift and professional as they prepared Jason for transport. Every procedure was designed to prevent further damage to his spine, each movement carefully calculated to maintain proper alignment. Jason remained conscious throughout the process, watching the arena lights blur and shift as they loaded him into the ambulance. "Sarah," he called weakly as the ambulance doors prepared to close. She appeared at his side, tears streaming down her face as she gripped his hand with desperate intensity. "I'm right here, baby," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere. Miguel's driving us to the hospital right behind you." The ride to John Peter Smith Hospital seemed to last forever, and no time at all simultaneously. Jason drifted in and out of consciousness as the paramedics worked to stabilize his condition, their radio chatter a constant background hum of medical terminology that he only partially understood. What he did understand with perfect clarity was that his life had changed forever in the space of 8 seconds, though he had only managed to stay aboard Reaper for 7 of them. The emergency room at JPS Hospital was a flurry of controlled chaos as the trauma team prepared for Jason's arrival. Dr. Michael Chun, the hospital's chief of neurosurgery, had been alerted to the incoming spinal injury and was already reviewing preliminary information when the ambulance pulled into the bay. Sarah and Miguel arrived moments later, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. X-rays and MRI scans confirmed Dr. Chen's worst fears. Jason's L2 and L3 vertebrae had suffered complete compression fractures, with bone fragments pressing against his spinal cord. The damage was extensive and irreversible, the kind of injury that ended not just careers but changed the fundamental nature of how a person moved through the world. "Mr. McCall," Dr. Chen said gently as Jason emerged from the sedation used during the imaging procedures. "I need to discuss your injuries with you and your wife. The compression fractures to your lower lumbar vertebrae have caused severe damage to your spinal cord. While we can perform surgery to stabilize the fractures and remove some of the pressure, the neurological damage appears to be permanent." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Jason stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in each square, as if they might hold the answer to a question he wasn't ready to ask. "What does that mean exactly, Doc?" Jason finally managed, his voice steadier than he felt. Dr. Chen's expression was compassionate, but direct. "It means that you will likely never walk again, Mr. McCall. The injury has resulted in complete paraplegia below the level of the fracture. With extensive rehabilitation, you can expect to regain full function of your upper body and live a productive, fulfilling life, but your legs will remain paralyzed." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, their meaning clear but somehow impossible to fully comprehend. Jason had built his entire identity around physical prowess, around his ability to control and dominate animals that outweighed him by more than 1,000 pounds. Now he couldn't even wiggle his toes. Outside the hospital window, the lights of Fort Worth twinkled in the darkness, the city continuing its nightly rhythm as if nothing had changed. But for Jason McCall, everything had changed in the time it took a bull named Reaper to prove once again why he had never been successfully ridden. If this story has already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. 3 weeks had passed since the accident, and Jason McCall found himself staring at the institutional green walls of the rehabilitation center with a mixture of rage and resignation that had become his constant companion. The Texas Rehabilitation Institute was considered one of the finest spinal cord injury facilities in the Southwest, its modern equipment and expert staff offering hope to patients who had none. But hope was a luxury that Jason couldn't afford, not when every morning brought the same devastating realization that his legs remained as unresponsive as blocks of wood. The physical therapy room buzzed with activity as other patients worked through their own battles with paralysis, traumatic brain injuries, and amputations. The sound of wheelchairs rolling across polished floors mixed with the encouraging voices of therapists and the occasional grunt of exertion from someone pushing their body to its limits. Jason watched it all from his corner table, where he was supposed to be practicing transferring from his wheelchair to a bed, a skill that his occupational therapist insisted was crucial for independent living. Independent living. The phrase tasted bitter in his mouth, like medicine that promised to heal but only reminded you of how sick you were. "All right, Jason, let's try this again," said Rebecca Martinez, his occupational therapist, as she positioned the transfer board between his wheelchair and the practice bed. Rebecca was in her early 30s, with short black hair and the kind of determined optimism that Jason found increasingly irritating. She had been working with spinal cord patients for 8 years and had seen dozens of men and women overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But she had never worked with anyone quite as resistant to rehabilitation as Jason McCall. "What's the point?" Jason muttered, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair with white-knuckled intensity. "I can't feel anything below my waist. How am I supposed to know if I'm doing it right?" Rebecca's expression remained patient, though Jason caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested his attitude was beginning to wear on her professional composure. "That's exactly why we practice, Jason. You need to learn to use your upper body strength and visual cues to compensate for the loss of sensation. Thousands of people with spinal cord injuries live completely independent lives. Those people weren't professional athletes," Jason snapped, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "They didn't build their entire existence around physical ability. They didn't spend 15 years defining themselves by what their bodies could do. The room fell silent as other patients and staff turned to look at the source of the outburst. Jason felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by his loss of control, but too angry to apologize. Rebecca dismissed the stares with a professional smile and pulled up a chair next to Jason's wheelchair. "You're right," she said quietly, her voice gentle but firm. "You're absolutely right that this is different for you. But you know what? Every person in this room had their life completely turned upside down by their injury. The construction worker over there who fell 3 stories and broke his neck was also defining himself by what his body could do. The young mother who was hit by a drunk driver was defining herself by her ability to chase after her toddler in the backyard." Jason looked around the room with new eyes, seeing for the first time the individual struggles hidden behind each wheelchair and walker. A man in his 50s was laboriously moving from his chair to parallel bars, sweat beading on his forehead as he forced his damaged legs to support his weight for a few precious seconds. A woman barely out of her teens was learning to navigate stairs in a wheelchair, her jaw set with determination as she practiced the technique over and over. "The difference," Rebecca continued, "is that most of them don't have the strength, conditioning, and competitive drive that you've spent 15 years developing. Those qualities that made you a champion bull rider? They're going to make you a champion at this too, if you'll let them." Before Jason could respond, Sarah appeared in the doorway of the therapy room, her arms laden with a care package from home and her face wearing the forced brightness that had become her default expression since the accident. She had been making the 40-minute drive from their ranch in Weatherford every day, timing her visits to coincide with his therapy sessions so she could learn the techniques that would help him transition back to home life. "Hey, baby," she said, setting down her packages and kissing the top of his head. "How's the session going?" "Just peachy," Jason replied with a bitter laugh. "I'm learning how to be helpless in a whole new way." Sarah's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered her composure. Rebecca excused herself to give them privacy, though Jason noticed she stayed within earshot in case she was needed. The other patients continued their exercises, but Jason could feel their occasional glances, a mixture of curiosity and sympathy that made his skin crawl. "Dr. Peterson called this morning," Sarah said, settling into the chair Rebecca had vacated. Dr. Peterson was their family physician and had been coordinating Jason's care since the accident. "He said your upper body strength measurements are actually improving. The work you're doing here is making you stronger." "Stronger for what?" Jason asked, his voice hollow. "So I can more effectively move myself from one chair to another? So I can reach things on high shelves without falling over." Sarah's composure finally cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks as she gripped his hands in hers. "Stronger so you can come home to me," she whispered. "Stronger so we can figure out what our life looks like now. Stronger so you can still be my husband instead of my patient." The words hit Jason like a physical blow, forcing him to confront a truth he had been desperately avoiding. In his anger and self-pity, he had been so focused on what he had lost that he hadn't considered what he still had to lose. Sarah was 29 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and completely devoted to a man who could no longer be the husband she had married. She deserved better than a bitter, broken cowboy who spent his days wallowing in resentment. "I'm scared, Sarah," he admitted, the words coming out in a whisper so quiet she had to lean closer to hear them. "I'm scared that I'll never be the man you fell in love with. I'm scared that you'll wake up one day and realize you married someone who could protect you and provide for you and be strong for you, and now you're stuck with someone who can't even get out of bed without help." Sarah's tears came harder now, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Jason McCall, you listen to me. I didn't fall in love with your legs. I didn't marry your ability to ride bulls or lift heavy objects or walk across a room. I fell in love with your heart, your stubborn determination, your terrible jokes, and the way you make me feel like I'm the only woman in the world. None of those things require the use of your legs." Rebecca had begun working with another patient, but Jason caught her looking in their direction with what might have been approval. Around them, the rhythm of rehabilitation continued, the steady persistence of people refusing to let their injuries define the limits of their lives. For the first time since the accident, Jason began to consider the possibility that his story might not be over, just different. "Tell me about the ranch," he said finally, needing to connect with something beyond the sterile environment of the rehab center. "How are the horses? Is Miguel still taking care of the stock?" Sarah's face brightened with genuine relief at the change in his tone. "Miguel's been amazing. He's basically moved into the bunkhouse, and refuses to accept any payment. Says you'd do the same for him, which we both know is true. The horses are good, though Thunder keeps looking for you every morning. He stands at the fence by the house and whinnies whenever he sees my car. Thunder was Jason's favorite cutting horse, a 15-year-old quarter horse gelding with the intelligence and athleticism that had made him invaluable for working cattle. The image of the horse waiting for his return sent a pang of longing through Jason's chest that was almost physical in its intensity. "Do you think," Jason began hesitantly, "do you think there's any way I could still work with the horses? I mean, I know I can't do what I used to do, but maybe there's something." "Jason, there are plenty of people with spinal cord injuries who work with horses," Rebecca interjected, having finished with her other patient. "There are therapeutic riding programs, adaptive equipment for ranch work, and training methods that don't require full mobility. Your knowledge and experience with horses don't disappear just because you're in a wheelchair." The idea took root in Jason's mind like a seed finding fertile ground. He had assumed that his injury meant the end of any meaningful connection to the life he had built, but perhaps there were possibilities he hadn't considered. The physical demands of bull riding were obviously out of the question, but his understanding of animal behavior, his eye for quality livestock, and his reputation in the rodeo community might still have value. "There's something else," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she had been building up to this moment. "The PBR called yesterday. They want to offer you a position as a livestock consultant. It would involve traveling to events, evaluating bulls, and working with younger riders on technique and safety. The pay would be good, and it would keep you connected to the sport." Jason felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him was touched that the Professional Bull Riders Organization wanted to find a way to keep him involved. Another part was insulted by what felt like a consolation prize, a way to make him feel useful without actually being essential. But underneath both reactions was something else, something that felt suspiciously like hope. "I need to think about it," he said finally. "Right now, I can barely get myself from this chair to that bed without help. I'm not ready to make decisions about the rest of my life." "That's fair," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "But maybe we could start with smaller goals. Rebecca, what does Jason need to master before he can come home?" Rebecca consulted her chart, running through the checklist of skills that marked the difference between institutional care and independent living. Transfers, obviously. Bathroom routines, including catheter management. Cooking from a wheelchair. Driving with hand controls. Basic wheelchair maintenance. We're probably looking at another 4 to 6 weeks if Jason commits to the program. 4 to 6 weeks. It seemed like an eternity to Jason, but he could see the relief in Sarah's eyes at having a concrete timeline. She had been living in limbo for 3 weeks, unsure when or if her husband would be coming home. Now she had something to plan for, something to hope toward. "All right," Jason said, surprising himself with the decision. "Let's do the transfer exercise again. But this time, explain to me exactly what muscles I should be feeling and how to know if I'm doing it right." Rebecca's face lit up with professional satisfaction. This was the breakthrough she had been waiting for, the moment when a patient stopped being a victim and started being a participant in their own recovery. She repositioned the transfer board and began breaking down the movement into its component parts, explaining how his shoulders, arms, and core muscles would need to work together to compensate for his paralyzed legs. The exercise was exhausting and frustrating, requiring him to develop entirely new movement patterns and muscle memory. But for the first time since the accident, Jason felt like he was working towards something instead of just enduring it. Each successful transfer was a small victory, proof that he could still learn and grow and overcome challenges, even if they were different challenges than he had faced before. As the afternoon wore on, other patients stopped by to offer encouragement and advice. Jason began to see them not as reminders of his own limitations, but as examples of human resilience and adaptability. The construction worker who had fallen 3 stories was now strong enough to return to work in a supervisory capacity. The young mother was planning to coach her daughter's soccer team from her wheelchair. Each story was a testament to the possibility of building a meaningful life after devastating loss. When visiting hours ended and Sarah prepared to leave for the night, Jason felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident: anticipation for tomorrow. He still faced months of hard work and adjustment, and he knew there would be setbacks and dark days ahead. But for the first time, he could imagine a future that extended beyond the confines of his current limitations. "I love you," he told Sarah as she gathered her things. "And I'm sorry for being such a difficult patient. You deserve better than what I've been giving you. I love you too, she replied, kissing him goodbye. And difficult patients get better faster than easy ones. It means you're fighting. As she left, Jason looked around the therapy room with new eyes. Tomorrow he would work on transfers again, and bathroom routines, and all the mundane skills that would allow him to return to some version of normal life. It wouldn't be the life he had planned, but it might still be a life worth living. The man who had once conquered 2,000-pound bulls was learning to conquer the simple act of moving from one chair to another. It was humbling and frustrating, and nothing like he had imagined his life would become. But it was progress, and progress was something he could build on. He's taking care of you, Miguel observed as they reached the training pen. Horses know when their people are vulnerable. He's not going to do anything that might put you at risk. The realization hit Jason like a physical blow. Thunder's careful behavior wasn't respect or adaptation, it was pity. The horse that had once challenged him to be better, that had demanded excellence and precision in their partnership, was now treating him like an invalid. The gelding's protective instincts, admirable as they were, represented everything Jason feared about his new reality. Let's try some groundwork, Jason said, his voice tight with determination. I want to see if I can still get him to respond to pressure and release from the chair. He began with simple exercises, asking Thunder to move his hindquarters and forequarters in response to pressure from a training stick. The horse complied readily, perhaps too readily, lacking the spirited resistance that had once made him such an effective cutting horse. Jason increased the difficulty of the exercises, asking for more precise movements and quicker responses, but Thunder continued to perform with the careful compliance of a horse humoring a disabled handler. He's not giving you his best, Sarah said quietly, voicing what they were all thinking. He's holding back. Jason felt the familiar surge of anger that had become his constant companion since the accident. It wasn't Thunder's fault. The horse was responding to the change in energy and authority that came with Jason's altered circumstances. But knowing that didn't make it any less frustrating to work with an animal that was treating him like an invalid. Maybe we should try a different horse, Miguel suggested. One that doesn't have such a long history with you. A horse that doesn't know what you used to be capable of. The suggestion made sense from a training perspective, but it felt like defeat to Jason. Thunder had been his partner for over a decade, the horse he had trusted with his life in countless cutting competitions. If he couldn't maintain that partnership in his new circumstances, what hope did he have of building new relationships with young horses that had never known him as anything other than a man in a wheelchair? No, Jason said firmly. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. Thunder and I are going to figure this out together, even if it takes months. He spent the next hour working with the horse, gradually increasing the intensity and precision of his requests. Thunder's responses remained careful and measured, but Jason began to detect subtle changes in the horse's body language. The gelding's ears became more alert, his movements more energetic as he began to sense that his handler expected excellence rather than mere compliance. There, Sarah said suddenly, pointing to a moment when Thunder executed a particularly sharp turn in response to Jason's cue. Did you see that? He forgot to hold back for just a second. It was a small victory, but it represented progress toward the partnership that Jason desperately wanted to rebuild. Thunder had shown a flash of his old spirit, responding to Jason's authority rather than his perceived vulnerability. It wasn't the same as their relationship had been before the accident, but it was a foundation they could build on. As the morning progressed, Jason began to develop new techniques for working with horses from his wheelchair. He learned to use the chair's momentum to add emphasis to his cues, to position himself for maximum leverage when applying pressure, and to read the subtle changes in a horse's body language that indicated respect versus pity. It was exhausting work, both physically and emotionally, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that Jason hadn't experienced since before the accident. You know what I think? Miguel said as they led Thunder back to the barn. I think you might actually become a better horse trainer now than you were before. Jason looked at his friend skeptically. How do you figure that? Before, you relied a lot on physical dominance and athletic ability. You could muscle a horse into compliance if you needed to. Now you have to use your mind and your understanding of horse psychology. You have to be smarter and more strategic. The idea intrigued Jason more than he wanted to admit. His entire career had been built on physical prowess and split-second reactions. Perhaps there was something to be gained from being forced to approach horse training from a completely different angle, using intelligence and patience instead of strength and speed. "There's something else we need to discuss," Sarah said as they unsaddled Thunder and put him back in his stall. The PBR called again about that consultant position. They want an answer by the end of the week. Jason had been avoiding the decision for months, unsure whether he was ready to return to the world of professional rodeo, even in a diminished capacity. The idea of traveling to events and working with young riders appealed to him, but it also meant confronting the reality of what he had lost. Every time he watched someone else climb onto a bull, he would be reminded of the life that had been taken from him in 8 seconds of chaos and violence. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, genuinely uncertain about the right choice. "I think," Sarah said carefully, "that you need to decide whether you want to be a former bull rider who got hurt or a horseman who happens to use a wheelchair. Those are 2 very different identities, and they'll lead to very different futures." Her words carried the weight of months of observation and careful thought. Jason realized that she had been watching him struggle not just with the physical challenges of his injury, but with the fundamental question of who he was going to be in this new reality. The PBR consultant position would keep him connected to his past, but it might also prevent him from fully embracing his future. "I need more time," he said finally. "I'm not ready to make that decision yet." "That's okay," Sarah replied. "But don't wait too long. Sometimes the best opportunities have expiration dates." As they walked back to the house, Jason reflected on the morning's progress and challenges. Working with Thunder had been both more difficult and more promising than he had expected. The horse's initial protective behavior had been disheartening, but the flashes of their old partnership had given him hope that they could rebuild their relationship on new terms. The ranch spread out around them in the afternoon light, 240 acres of possibility and responsibility that represented everything they had built together. Jason had always thought of the land in terms of what he could accomplish on horseback, but perhaps it was time to consider what he could accomplish from a wheelchair. The perspective was different, but the potential might be just as great. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner and Jason worked on ranch paperwork at the kitchen table, he found himself thinking about identity and adaptation. The accident had forced him to confront the question of who he was beyond his ability to ride bulls, and the answer was still evolving. But for the first time since that devastating night in Fort Worth, he was beginning to believe that the answer might be someone worth becoming. 2 years had passed since the accident that changed everything, and Jason McCall found himself sitting in the passenger seat of his modified pickup truck, watching the familiar skyline of Fort Worth grow larger in the windshield. The city's gleaming towers caught the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the urban landscape that had once felt like a second home. Today it felt like foreign territory, a place where dreams went to die in 8 seconds of chaos and pain. Sarah drove with the quiet concentration that had become her default expression during stressful situations, her hands steady on the wheel as she navigated the increasingly heavy traffic. They were returning to the Will Rogers Memorial Center for the first time since the accident, not as spectators, but as participants in a new venture that represented everything Jason had learned about adaptation and possibility in the 2 years since his world collapsed. In the truck bed behind them, carefully secured and cushioned, rode Thunder and 2 young cutting horses that Jason had been training for the past 18 months. The horses were destined for a demonstration that would either validate Jason's new career direction or confirm his worst fears about his diminished capabilities. The stakes felt impossibly high, weighted with the judgment of an industry that had once celebrated him as a champion. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said for the 3rd time in an hour, her voice carrying the same mixture of support and concern that had characterized her approach to Jason's recovery. "We can turn around right now and go home. Nobody would think less of you." Jason adjusted his position in the specialized seat that allowed him to drive using hand controls, a small miracle of engineering that had given him back a measure of independence. "People already think less of me," he replied with a bitter laugh. "The question is whether I'm going to let that define what I can accomplish." The demonstration was the culmination of months of preparation and persuasion. Jason had spent the better part of a year developing new training techniques specifically designed for horsemen with mobility limitations, methods that emphasized mental connection and subtle communication over physical dominance. The National Cutting Horse Association had agreed to let him present his approach at their annual convention, but Jason suspected the invitation had more to do with novelty than genuine interest in his innovations. Miguel was already at the venue when they arrived, having trailered his own horses earlier in the day. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder of how much Jason's life had changed. Where they had once been equals competing at the highest levels of their sport, Miguel now served as Jason's assistant and advocate, a role reversal that spoke to the depth of their friendship, but also highlighted Jason's dependence on others. "The arena's set up exactly like you requested," Miguel reported as they began unloading the horses. "I walked through the demonstration with the sound crew this morning, and everything should run smoothly. There are about 300 people registered for the session. 300 horsemen and women who had come to see if the former bull riding champion could offer anything of value from his wheelchair, or if this was merely a curiosity show designed to make the industry feel good about including a disabled cowboy." Jason tried to push down the cynical voice in his head that whispered about pity and patronization, focusing instead on the horses that represented his best argument for relevance. Thunder had aged gracefully in the 2 years since Jason's return to training, his movements more measured but his intelligence sharper than ever. The gelding had adapted to Jason's wheelchair-based training methods with an intuitive understanding that sometimes bordered on the supernatural. It was as if the horse had recognized that their partnership required a new language, one based on trust and communication rather than physical cues. The 2 younger horses, a mare named Whisper and a gelding called Storm, were products of Jason's new training philosophy from the beginning. They had never known him as anything other than a horseman who worked from a wheelchair, and their responses to his methods were unencumbered by the complicated emotions that sometimes affected Thunder. Both horses showed the kind of precision and responsiveness that had made Jason's reputation before the accident, proving that his abilities as a trainer had survived the loss of his legs. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked as they made their way toward the arena entrance. She walked beside his wheelchair with the easy familiarity that had developed over 2 years of navigating public spaces together, anticipating obstacles and offering assistance without making him feel diminished. "Terrified," Jason admitted with an honesty that would have been impossible during his competitive years. 2 years ago, I knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of. Now I'm about to ask 300 people to believe in a version of myself that I'm still figuring out." The arena was smaller than the massive rodeo venues where Jason had built his reputation, but it held the concentrated attention of an audience that understood horses in ways that casual spectators never could. These were professional trainers, breeders, and competitors who could spot genuine skill from across an arena and had little patience for demonstrations that wasted their time. Jason positioned his wheelchair at the edge of the round pen that had been set up in the center of the arena, checking the specialized equipment that Miguel had helped him design. The modified training sticks were lighter and longer than conventional tools, allowing him to apply precise pressure from his seated position. A small wireless microphone would allow the audience to hear his quiet communications with the horses, something that had never been possible during traditional demonstrations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice echoed through the arena, "please welcome Jason McCall, 3-time world champion bull rider and founder of Adaptive Equine Training Systems." The applause was polite but restrained, the kind of reception reserved for unknown quantities and feel-good stories. Jason recognized the tone from his own days as a spectator at events where retired champions attempted comebacks or demonstrated teaching methods of questionable value. He would have to earn genuine respect through performance, not sentiment. Thunder entered the pen with the dignity and presence that had made him a champion-cutting horse, his attention focused entirely on Jason despite the crowd and unfamiliar surroundings. Jason began with basic exercises, asking the horse to move his feet and change directions using the subtle pressure techniques he had developed. To the audience, it might have looked like simple groundwork, but experienced horsemen would recognize the precision and timing required to achieve such immediate responses. "What you're seeing," Jason's voice carried clearly through the microphone, "is the result of training methods that emphasize mental connection over physical dominance. Because I can't rely on my legs for stability or my full body for leverage, I've had to develop techniques that are based entirely on clear communication and mutual respect." He guided Thunder through increasingly complex exercises, demonstrating how the horse would respond to the slightest shift in Jason's body position or the most subtle change in pressure from his training stick. The gelding's movements were fluid and precise, his ears constantly tuned to Jason's position as if connected by an invisible thread. Traditional training methods often rely on the trainer's ability to move quickly around the horse, to apply physical pressure from multiple angles, Jason continued, his voice calm and educational despite the tension he felt. "When those options are removed, you're forced to develop a more sophisticated understanding of how horses think and learn. The audience was beginning to lean forward in their seats, recognizing that they were witnessing something more substantial than a motivational demonstration. Thunder's responses to Jason's cues were becoming more dramatic and athletic, the horse stretching into extended gaits and sharp direction changes that showcased both his training and Jason's skill as a communicator. "Now I'm going to ask Thunder to demonstrate some of the cutting moves that made him a champion," Jason announced, introducing a mechanical cow that would provide the visual stimulus for the horse's instinctive herding behaviors. These movements require split-second timing and incredible athletic ability, but they're initiated and controlled entirely through mental communication. Thunder's transformation was immediate and dramatic. The aging gelding seemed to shed years as he locked onto the mechanical cow, his body coiling with the controlled power that had made cutting horses the athletes of the horse world. Jason's role became that of a conductor guiding a virtuoso performance, his subtle cues directing Thunder's natural instincts into the precise movements that defined elite cutting. The audience erupted in appreciation as Thunder executed a series of lightning-quick stops and turns, his body perfectly balanced and his attention laser-focused on his target. Jason remained calm and centered in his wheelchair, his communications with the horse so subtle that they were almost invisible to observers. It was a level of partnership that transcended physical limitation, a demonstration of what was possible when human intelligence combined with animal instinct. "What we're seeing here," said Dr. Rebecca Harrison, a veterinary behaviorist who was serving as a guest commentator, "is actually a more refined version of traditional cutting training. Mr. McCall's limitations have forced him to develop techniques that rely on the horse's intelligence rather than physical correction, and the results speak for themselves." Jason's confidence grew as he moved to the second part of his demonstration, working with Whisper to show how his methods could be applied to young horses with no previous training. The mare was 3 years old and had been under saddle for less than 6 months, but her responses to Jason's training showed the kind of precision and willingness that typically took years to develop. "The key," Jason explained as he guided Whisper through basic maneuvers, "is establishing communication before attempting control. Most training problems occur because we're asking horses to do things they don't understand, or we're applying pressure without giving them clear ways to release that pressure." Whisper's improvement was visible even during the 20-minute demonstration, her movements becoming more confident and balanced as she learned to trust Jason's guidance. The young mare seemed to understand that cooperation brought comfort, while resistance brought only persistent but gentle pressure until she found the correct response. The final portion of the demonstration featured Storm, a 4-year-old gelding that Jason had trained specifically for riders with disabilities. The horse had been taught to stand perfectly still during mounting procedures, to respond to hand signals as well as traditional cues, and to provide the kind of stable, predictable partnership that could give disabled riders confidence in the saddle. "Adaptive riding isn't just about modifying equipment," Jason said as he worked with Storm. "It's about training horses that understand their riders might have different capabilities and limitations. This gelding has been taught to be a partner rather than just a mount, to take care of his rider as much as his rider takes care of him." Storm demonstrated his training by standing motionless as Jason transferred from his wheelchair to a mounting platform, then remaining calm and steady as Jason settled into a specialized saddle designed for riders with limited lower body function. The horse's behavior was a testament to both his training and his temperament, showing the kind of reliability that could transform the lives of people who thought their riding days were over. The audience's response was immediate and overwhelming. What had begun as polite interest had transformed into genuine enthusiasm as horsemen recognized the practical applications of Jason's methods. The techniques he had developed out of necessity could benefit any trainer working with difficult or sensitive horses, and his approach to communication had applications far beyond adaptive riding. "Mr. McCall," called a voice from the audience as Jason concluded his demonstration, "how long does it take to train a horse using these methods?" "That depends on the horse and the goals," Jason replied, guiding Storm back to the center of the arena. "But I've found that horses trained with these communication-based methods often progress faster than those trained with traditional dominance techniques. When a horse understands what you're asking and trusts that cooperation brings comfort, the learning process accelerates dramatically." Questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from specific training techniques to the business applications of adaptive horse training. Jason found himself energized by the engagement, his confidence growing as he realized that the audience was treating him as an expert rather than a curiosity. These were serious professionals asking serious questions about methods that could improve their own work with horses. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer finally intervened, "let's show our appreciation for Jason McCall and his incredible demonstration of adaptive horse training." The applause was thunderous this time, a standing ovation that acknowledged not just the quality of the demonstration, but the courage it had taken to reinvent himself so completely. Jason felt tears stinging his eyes as he looked out at the crowd, seeing not pity but respect in the faces of people who understood what they had witnessed. Sarah was waiting at the arena gate with tears streaming down her face, her expression combining pride, relief, and love in proportions that took Jason's breath away. Miguel appeared beside her with the kind of grin that Jason remembered from their competitive days, the expression of a friend who had just watched someone he cared about achieve something remarkable. "How does it feel to be back?" Sarah asked as Jason rejoined them outside the arena. "Different," Jason replied, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. 2 years ago, I came to places like this to prove I was better than everyone else. Today I came to prove that I could still contribute something valuable. I think I like the second version better." The demonstration had been more than a professional success. It had been a personal breakthrough that allowed Jason to see himself as something other than a diminished version of his former self. The techniques he had developed out of necessity had proven to have value beyond his own circumstances, offering genuine benefits to horses and riders throughout the industry. "So what happens now?" Miguel asked as they began loading the horses for the journey home. "Now we go home and get back to work," Jason said with a smile that felt more genuine than any expression he had worn in 2 years. "I've got a business to build and horses to train, and apparently there are people who want to learn what I have to teach." The drive back to Weatherford passed in comfortable conversation about the day's success and the possibilities that lay ahead. Jason's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from trainers, riding programs, and organizations interested in his methods. The demonstration had opened doors that he hadn't even known existed, creating opportunities to build a career that was completely his own rather than a shadow of what he had lost. As they turned into their ranch driveway, Jason felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with identity. He was no longer a former bull rider who had been broken by a bull named Reaper. He was a horseman who happened to use a wheelchair, a trainer whose limitations had become the source of innovation rather than defeat. The ranch spread out before them in the evening light, 240 acres of possibility that now seemed larger rather than smaller than before his accident. Thunder whinnied from his trailer, eager to return to familiar surroundings, and Jason found himself laughing at the sound. They had all come home changed by the day's events, carrying new confidence and purpose that would shape everything that came next. "Thank you," Jason said to Sarah as they sat in the truck for a moment, watching the sun set over their land. "For what?" she asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "For believing I could become someone worth becoming," he replied, taking her hand in his. "For seeing possibilities when all I could see were limitations." Sarah leaned across the space between their seats and kissed him with the passion and tenderness that had sustained their marriage through the darkest period of their lives. When they broke apart, Jason saw in her eyes the reflection of a future that was bright with possibility, different from what they had originally planned, but perhaps even better for having been forged in the fire of adversity. The man who had once measured his worth in 8-second increments had learned to measure it in the trust of horses and the respect of peers who valued wisdom over physical prowess. Jason McCall was home, not just to the ranch where he had always lived, but to an identity that was entirely his own, built from the ruins of his former self and strengthened by the love of people who had never stopped believing in his potential for greatness. If this story has already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. "That depends on the horse and the goals," Jason replied, guiding Storm back to the center of the arena. "But I've found that horses trained with these communication-based methods often progress faster than those trained with traditional dominance techniques. When a horse understands what you're asking and trusts that cooperation brings comfort, the learning process accelerates dramatically." Questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from specific training techniques to the business applications of adaptive horse training. Jason found himself energized by the engagement, his confidence growing as he realized that the audience was treating him as an expert rather than a curiosity. These were serious professionals asking serious questions about methods that could improve their own work with horses. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer finally intervened, "let's show our appreciation for Jason McCall and his incredible demonstration of adaptive horse training." The applause was thunderous this time, a standing ovation that acknowledged not just the quality of the demonstration, but the courage it had taken to reinvent himself so completely. Jason felt tears stinging his eyes as he looked out at the crowd, seeing not pity, but respect in the faces of people who understood what they had witnessed. Sarah was waiting at the arena gate with tears streaming down her face, her expression combining pride, relief, and love in proportions that took Jason's breath away. Miguel appeared beside her with the kind of grin that Jason remembered from their competitive days, the expression of a friend who had just watched someone he cared about achieve something remarkable. "How does it feel to be back?" Sarah asked as Jason rejoined them outside the arena. "Different," Jason replied, surprising himself with the honesty of his answer. 2 years ago, I came to places like this to prove I was better than everyone else. Today I came to prove that I could still contribute something valuable. I think I like the second version better." The demonstration had been more than a professional success. It had been a personal breakthrough that allowed Jason to see himself as something other than a diminished version of his former self. The techniques he had developed out of necessity had proven to have value beyond his own circumstances, offering genuine benefits to horses and riders throughout the industry. "So what happens now?" Miguel asked as they began loading the horses for the journey home. "Now we go home and get back to work," Jason said with a smile that felt more genuine than any expression he had worn in 2 years. "I've got a business to build and horses to train, and apparently there are people who want to learn what I have to teach." The drive back to Weatherford passed in comfortable conversation about the day's success and the possibilities that lay ahead. Jason's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls from trainers, riding programs, and organizations interested in his methods. The demonstration had opened doors that he hadn't even known existed, creating opportunities to build a career that was completely his own rather than a shadow of what he had lost. As they turned into their ranch driveway, Jason felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with identity. He was no longer a former bull rider who had been broken by a bull named Reaper. He was a horseman who happened to use a wheelchair, a trainer whose limitations had become the source of innovation rather than defeat. The ranch spread out before them in the evening light, 240 acres of possibility that now seemed larger rather than smaller than before his accident. Thunder whinnied from his trailer, eager to return to familiar surroundings, and Jason found himself laughing at the sound. They had all come home changed by the day's events, carrying new confidence and purpose that would shape everything that came next. "Thank you," Jason said to Sarah as they sat in the truck for a moment, watching the sun set over their land. "For what?" she asked, though her smile suggested she already knew the answer. "For believing I could become someone worth becoming," he replied, taking her hand in his. "For seeing possibilities when all I could see were limitations." Sarah leaned across the space between their seats and kissed him with the passion and tenderness that had sustained their marriage through the darkest period of their lives. When they broke apart, Jason saw in her eyes the reflection of a future that was bright with possibility, different from what they had originally planned, but perhaps even better for having been forged in the fire of adversity. The man who had once measured his worth in 8-second increments had learned to measure it in the trust of horses and the respect of peers who valued wisdom over physical prowess. Jason McCall was home, not just to the ranch where he had always lived, but to an identity that was entirely his own, built from the ruins of his former self and strengthened by the love of people who had never stopped believing in his potential for greatness. If this story has already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories.